Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Trails in the Pod. I'm Colin. That over there is Kevin. Kevin, how you doing?
Doing well, Colin. Glad to be here. Glad to be starting this journey with you and everyone else.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So this is our first episode. We should probably say what the hell this show is about. The name is Trails in the Pod because this is a Trails podcast. I haven't really seen many Trails podcasts out there, but I'm a big fan of the series. And you've played a game and you want to get more into it. So we decided to fill a hole in the market and do a deep dive into the series.
It's a big, interconnected, epic story. 9 games and counting, excluding the, so-called prequels. Having the ability to look into development of the story, of the world, of the characters over such a long period in depth in the games and outside will really be a great experience for us.
I think so. The whole point of this show is to take the games slowly. Kevin and I were both from academic backgrounds, and we've learned over the years that yes, you can like blitz through something and get an understanding of the whole. That's how I played the games. I mean, I binged them when COVID started, but instead we want to say like, all right, for this week, we are playing the prologue. Then we'll get together and we'll talk about the prologue. Here's where we're at with the stories. What do we think about this character? What do we think about this new system? What kind of issues are being discussed in the game? This way, we hope that we can treat Trails and video games in general with the rigor that an art object actually deserves.
Take them slowly. Yes, and also, by nature, take them seriously. One of the things we'll be talking about later is video games are indeed art. There's good art and bad art out there, but we will take the premise that this series and video games as a whole deserve to be treated slowly and seriously.
But in addition to that, that also means that we can't have this show just be about the Trails series because, as you and I both know, you can't understand a piece of literature or a piece of music or a piece of art without knowing the context behind it all. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about, both about video games in general and about things outside of video games as a whole. The example that comes to my mind is that there's a character in the game named Gileath Osborne, who's called the Blood and Iron Chancellor. To anybody who knows anything about German history, that's a clear reference to Bismarck. So when we see that character, we'll first meet him in the third game, actually. We will, have an episode or maybe even 2 on Bismarck, see where his influences are, see what vision Bismarck had, and then see if we can analyze over time how Falcom is taking that model and using it for their own needs.
It's all part of a wider, longer conversation. The games are talking to one another, to spiritual and generic, in the literal sense, predecessors, and also it's a conversation about contemporary and historical matters.
And there's also going to be other things that, we're going to want to talk about anyway, maybe news items that pops up about Trails or JRPGs in general. Something that you and I had kicked off a couple of days ago was talking about what it means to preserve games as art. And that has nothing to do with Trails, but that has something to do with the medium entirely. And it's a fascinating topic. As a consequence, the way that we're going to structure this show is we're going to have one episode dealing with playing through the game. Then the next week, we'll have more than likely a topical episode. The reason for this is twofold. The first is we want to make sure that there's almost always something about Trails in the pipeline. But these are big ass RPGs. These are long. The first game is the shortest one, took me 53 hours with the turbo to get through it. The later ones can get up to 100 hours. We live lives, we can't just sit down and blitz through these while also then doing the podcast and taking care of our lives. I'm sure in both of our cases playing other games because, you don't want to get bored. So we're taking this very slowly, but we're building in failure time so that, if life gets in the way, somebody has to travel or whatever, there's still going to be content in the feed.
We're going to have a backlog. We're going to have different types of episode for variety. We're going to have a consistent, normal release schedule.
Indeed. But then the question becomes, well, what is this episode about? Because we haven't actually started playing through the first Trails game. We're going to do that after this episode is done. But if we want to analyze Trails as an art object, as a piece of literature, as a piece of art, what do scholars have to do that? We have to define our terms. Every book, every dissertation starts off with a methodology section. And that's basically what this is going to be. This is our first principles. What is an RPG? What is a JRPG? How do we evaluate JRPGs? What do we like to see in them? What does it mean for a JRPG to be successful? What are the constituent elements of that? And then probably some reflections on what it means to talk about games as art in general. So, Kevin, why don't you start us off with your thoughts?
Okay, so it's a role-playing game. You take on the persona, not the series, but the persona of someone not yourself. Okay, what does that mean exactly? I play, unlike Colin, a lot of sports games. FIFA, Madden, FIFA Manager, I throw controllers, it's all good. But say I create a team, or create a manager, or create a wide receiver, a quarterback, a running back that I make my own. Is that an RPG? Most people would say no, but it has role-playing elements, character creation, character progression, but I don't think many of us would call FIFA an RPG, would call Madden an RPG.
It's funny that you say that because I remember as a kid, I subscribed to Nintendo Power. And Nintendo Power had a feature every month about RPGs. And that was my favorite section of it because RPGs is my favorite genre. And I opened it up one month and it had like fucking Madden in there. It was a sports game. The entire section was trying to make that argument that indeed sports games are RPGs.
Well, maybe is it that our priors would lead us to discount, say, sports RPGs, most of us, most of the time, because the player base is so widely different. I would have to imagine for someone playing Trails in the Sky, Trails of Cold Steel versus the average Madden player, quite different audiences.
But I think also the games that we might call actual sports RPGs, like Golf Story, for instance, or like the Mario Tennis and golf games, you can look at them and you can easily say, no, that's an RPG because you have an overworld, you have people running around, you have a story, you have dialogue. But then the sport is the combat system of the game. Whereas with, I would say, FIFA or Madden, there it's more about the sport itself, and you have elements from role-playing games to enhance that experience.
Okay, so it's elements, but not the core.
So what is the
would
core?
You say what do you think, Colin? What's the base of the RPG?
Yeah, so in my opinion, which is going to kind of go contrary to what I just said about just there being elements, but I think the base of an RPG, Western or Japanese, is the character growth system. The whole
what's that?
You earn experience and level up and increase your stats, which helps your character perform better in the game. That's the most stereotypical standard progression system that you find in RPGs. Now, not every RPG has this. Some of them are quite successful at avoiding it. Others try to avoid it and fuck up. Looking at you, Final Fantasy VIII. And yet, that is like, when you narrow it down, you look at the most basic JRPGs. I'm talking Dragon Quest. I'm talking early Final Fantasy. It's basically just taking the character leveling system of Dungeons and Dragons and applying it to a virtual world.
But I didn't hear the word story in there. So can you have an RPG and not have a story?
You can. Well, you have to have some kind of framing device. The first Dragon Quest does not really have a story. It has a hook. The princess has been kidnapped, and you have an end goal: kill the big bad at the end. But that's it. There is no narrative in there whatsoever. And Dragon Quest has always struck me as almost the Weberian ideal type of what an RPG is, at least a JRPG. So it is clear that they exist, but story is it's an important constituent element of most RPGs.
Weberian, what's that?
Yeah, so I'm showing my hand here with our background. Max Weber is a sociologist, German. When he's looking at society, what he would do is he would look at a variety of historical examples of a distinct phenomenon, such as rulers or bureaucracy. And what he would try to do is take those disparate examples from all across history and construct what he called an ideal type. That is something that does not exist in reality, but shows the essence of that phenomenon in its most idealized or perfect form. That's kind of what I end up doing when I'm talking about RPGs. I'm consistently bringing in examples from different systems, different ages, in order to look at different systems and phenomena in RPGs.
A lot of us would say, oh, we need an overworld. Look at Skyrim.
Right.
Look at Final Fantasy, the later ones.
Well, the later ones
Not
don't
every
have it.
RPG, and not every RPG has an overworld. One of the elements today we think is so central to the RPG, but not in the early ones. Which raises the question, how much can we compare an RPG from 2022 to the late 1980s, early 1990s? Is that a fair comparison? Does it make us do anything? Is it productive?
I think so. You seem to have different thoughts on it. What's your thoughts?
You can compare them in kind, but not degree. Yeah, they're similar. You can see, the intellectual, spiritual successors, predecessors, genealogies, but so much has changed. Not just graphics, but what these games should do and can do. I don't know. I'm kind of against it.
I don't know. Like when I go back and I play Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy V is an excellent job system in which you're changing your classes all of the time. Just looking at that system, you can then understand later RPGs that do the same thing, such as Yakuza, Like a Dragon. Or if I'm looking at Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII, these are masterpieces of storytelling and character development, especially in Final Fantasy VII, that has had a huge impact on the rest of the genre. Therefore, yeah, even though they are retro games, I absolutely can use them to understand RPGs of today, because all of the RPGs today are made in a world in which these games already exist.
Okay, so these examples that you brought up, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, all sorts, they have the common of being JRPGs,
Yes.
Japanese RPGs. Is it just, an RPG made in Japan? That's a JRPG. If it's not, it's a Western RPG or just an RPG, or is it something deeper? What makes a JRPG a JRPG?
Yeah, when you had posed this question to me, I struggled with it, and I still don't think I have a good answer. But earlier on, yes, Japanese RPGs were made in Japan. Western RPGs were made in the West. Full stop. That's where it comes from. But that is not the case anymore. My first thought when you asked me that question was I was thinking of the game Bug Fables. Bug Fables, for those who don't know, is an excellent indie RPG released for modern systems. It's a spiritual successor to the first two Paper Mario games. It's developed in South America, and it's fantastic. And because its genealogy and is so drawn from the Paper Mario games, I can't call this a Western RPG. It has to be a JRPG, even though it's made in the Western world. Panama. Thank you, Kevin. It was developed in Panama. So not Southern America, Central America. So in that sense, what we have are two different traditions of RPG development. One starts in the West, one starts in the East, that they've interacted, all throughout. I mean, JRPGs are an offshoot of early Western RPGs, but over time, what we expect from a JRPG and what we expect from a Western RPG had been solidified, so that no matter where the game is developed, it can target one type of RPG or another.
So, like coming of age, that's the staple of JRPGs, isn't it? You look at Final Fantasy, Fire Emblem, Dragon Quest, all sorts. It's about, teenagers transitioning to adulthood. Are there any JRPGs that don't have this?
Oh God, yeah. Yakuza Like a Dragon is not about teenagers. It's about 30-year-old men trying to figure out their ways in the world. And that way, yes, sure, it's a bit of a coming of age story. Lost Odyssey is definitely not a coming of age because the main character is immortal and has been alive for thousands of years. He's already come of age. Yes, the young protagonist, the coming of age trope, it's very common. It's a very common framing device, but it is not the only framing device. And plus, you could then look at Western RPGs and point out that there are games that use that framing device too. Think of, say, Fallout 3. You're a baby in the bunker, and then now it's time for you to go out and explore the world on your own. That can be seen as a coming of age story.
But let me say this. Take the next Fallout, Fallout 4, in which the protagonist, though young, has to look for their child. They're the parent. Many JRPGs, do you play the role of a parent, searching or having the plot defined by the absence of your child, and not the opposite?
I am sure that there are JRPGs out there that do that. I really want to say Dragon Quest V because I know that you play as the parents in that game, but I think that then the parents turn into stone and then you play as the kids to get your parents back. I have not played Dragon Quest V, so I don't remember precisely how that works. I think that you bring up a good point that you do have more adult characters, more grounded in adult life in Western RPGs than you do in Japanese RPGs. I mean, in most JRPGs, you're 28 years old, you're an old man, right? And since we are 27 and 28, but it's not exactly the most precise way to delineate between the two types.
Okay, if it's not the most precise way to distinguish between these two types, then what would you say is?
That's
What
what I
about,
was.
say, player choice?
Well, that's exactly what I was about to say, Kevin. It's almost like we wrote this in an outline or something. So, in my opinion, if you look at some of the most famous Western RPGs, I'm thinking Divinity 2 Original Sin, Skyrim, well, like the Elder Scrolls series in general, Baldur's Gate. This is all about player choice in two means in the construction of your character. And these are very much based off of the ideal of Dungeons and Dragons, where you're putting skill points into whatever tree you want and you're customizing your character for it to play precisely as you want it to be. And narrative choice. Think of a game like The Witcher, in which multiple quests will end differently depending on what you do and what you say and how you do it. Think of Mass Effect, where same thing, certain characters will join you or not join you depending on what you say. You might have to kill one of your party members. For example, in the first game, you might have to kill Rex unless you earn his loyalty. You do have to kill one of your party members in Mass Effect 1. It's a choice that you have to make, which one's going to die. And the correct answer is Ashley. Everybody knows that. But if you look at but if you look at JRPGs, yes, there are choices. I mean, Final Fantasy VII does have a character customization system in which you can build the characters in different ways, but it's a much more linear experience most of the time. Not all of the time, but most of the time. You have a story that you're following the story. There are side quests too, but it's not like you're running around exploring everything, forgetting about the main story completely. Even games like Xenoblade Chronicles that do kind of get close to this don't really. They're not open world. It's not a playground in the way that The Witcher 3 is.
And if I can interject, I think one of the core things is not just story, but with this linear, it's experiencing the story.
Yeah.
Versus creating the story with your own, say headcanons or your own imagination versus something experiencing it for JRPGs in the order, really, that is intended by the developers in a manner that's intended. It can be a lot more specific, but there's also, there's trade-offs as well.
Yeah, of course. But I do want to stress here, we're making distinctions between Japanese RPGs and Western RPGs. But you can find exceptions for all of these distinctions in like every possible means. Like one of the things that I would say is, okay, what is the JRPG? Like what is, the most basic JRPG? And that is, as I said before, it's Dragon Quest 1. You have overworld exploration, you have town exploration, dungeon exploration, turn-based combat, and a narrative. That is what defines a JRPG. Everything else is a deviation from that norm. But there are games that will eschew all of those norms and still be called JRPGs in their own right. And the same is true for Western RPGs. We think through these categories in order to understand the genre better, but we cannot be prescriptive.
So we've talked a lot about what's an RPG and what's a JRPG, but how do we look at them? How do we evaluate, say, this game is good? Mm-hmm. This game is successful at executing its ideas, which may not be the same thing. And of course, how fun is it to play? 3 similar but distinct ideas.
Yeah, I want to hear your thoughts on this first. How do you evaluate an RPG?
Okay, one thing, if I'm going to buy a game, I'll look at reviews. I'll talk to people I know and trust, whose opinions I like. But that brings us to the idea, how should people look at games and review them? Video games are art. That's something people say a lot. And I agree with. But how do we look at that art? Movie critics don't make movies. Book critics aren't often authors. So we don't expect video game critics to be developers, but how should they look at games? Should they be good at the game? How much knowledge should they have of the game, of the history, of the genre? I think all of us can look at, say, review sites, IGN, that the reviewers don't put any effort into the game because they don't understand it, they're bad at it, they're a mouthpiece for the developers. But we know it's bad. But what should we do instead? How should we look at RPGs, at games in general?
Well, you've asked a lot of questions, and something that drives me nuts about academics is we ask a lot of questions and we don't provide a lot of answers. So I want to know your thoughts. How do you evaluate an RPG?
I evaluate on two things, Colin. One, is it fun? Two, after I'm done with the session or with the game, does it stay within me? Is it I won't think about it again, or does something take hold of me, the characters, the plot, the implications? Want to go out and read some fan fiction? If it has this hold, if it captures me after I'm done playing, to me, that's a successful RPG.
And
How
what?
about you?
Sure. So, I mean, I agree with you to some extent. I wrote down in this outline that I have to evaluate on how successful it is at executing its ideas, as you said, and how fun it is to play. And I can't really quantify a game being fun, especially since it so much depends on where I am at the time. If I've played through like 3 RPGs and I try a fourth one, it's not going to stick. Like I will need to play something else. So in that case, it's not the fault of the game. It's the fault of me that I'm not enjoying it. But I can pinpoint the moment that I know that a game is fun when I'm sitting down and I'm playing it and I find myself exclaiming, I'm having so much fun, or I fucking love this game, or, oh, I love this moment, or I love this system, stuff like that. But when it comes to how successful it is at executing its ideas, that we have to like identify what a constituent part of the JRPG is, and then we can evaluate.
I think all of us have games that have so much potential.
Yeah.
They try to do so much, and maybe they do raise interesting questions or commentaries, but man, this game fucking sucks to play. And there has to be this give and take between the player and the game that we don't see, or not as much in a novel or a movie where it's a much more static relationship, but games are interactive.
I think Final Fantasy II for the NES is a perfect example of a game with interesting ideas that fucking sucks to play. I don't know how much you know about this game, but it's basically Squaresoft, kicked it out of the park with the first Final Fantasy. They're like, okay, we need to make a second one. Let's not use levels anymore. Let's not use experience points. Instead, what will happen is that all of the stats will increase as the player uses them. So if you want to increase your hit points, you got to get hit. If you want to increase your strength stat, you have to, attack. Same with weapon levels as well. So like axes and swords start off really slow and really weak until you keep using them.
So two questions. One, with that was Final Fantasy 2. With that, how was there a Final Fantasy 3 made? And two, I knew Oblivion stole this crappy idea from somewhere else.
Well, other RPGs have used this as well. It was particularly bad in Final Fantasy II. I mean, you would end up just hitting your own party members so that you could get more HP. Like that's how you would have to grind that stuff out. Luckily, I think they sold enough that they could then make a Final Fantasy III. If Final Fantasy III is much more back to basics while having interesting ideas that Final Fantasy V would pick up on. So, but I think that is a good example of a game that has an interesting idea, but it is not successful at executing it because when you're trying to use the system is fighting against you. You have to go out of your way to break the system in order to make it work.
I agree. One thing now, let's transition to what makes a game good. Oftentimes, I think it has to have a good plot. Can you think of good movies, good books, good TV show, good games that don't have a good plot? It's tough. Fun movies, fun TV shows, yeah. But if we're going to call something good, I think the plot also has to be good. But again, what's that mean?
I would agree with you. I do want to push back a little bit before we get into the games about a book being good without having a good plot. Yesterday, I just finished reading All the King's Men, which I was promised was a fantastic political novel. It is not. It is not a political novel at all. What it is a thematic exploration of idealistic people and realistic people and the tragedy that can come about when human life gets in the way, emphasizing how we all live in a sinful world. The plot is not good, but the writing is good. The ideas in it are good. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, okay, if a novel can get away with that, can an RPG also get away with that? And I think it's a lot harder. I think it's a lot harder because the time investment that you have to put in there, it's a lot bigger. You know, most books do not take you anywhere from 30 to 40 to 50 hours to read. Maybe a Dostoevsky, you know, or it depends on the speed at which you read. But by and large, if you're a nerd, fucking nerd. Whereas with an RPG, it's not just here's the story. It's all the stuff around the story that pulls the player in, but you have to want to follow the story to keep doing everything else. The story is like a reward that you get for finishing this dungeon or beating this boss. Therefore, the genre is constructed in such a way that a good plot is more important than other forms of media.
The role you are playing in these games, it has to be acted on by outside forces. And that means the plot, the story, has to stimulate you, the character, you, the other characters in the party, to make it worthwhile. What's the story of FIFA? Not as important as the story for Final Fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
For Elder Scrolls. And that's why a lot of the criticism of, say, Skyrim is that there's not much of a story, which I happen to agree with.
Not because it's true. I mean, there's not much to agree with there. It's just a description of reality. But yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point that plots are not as important to other genres. I have just beaten Kirby and the Forgotten Land a couple of days ago. It has a plot. You don't play it for the plot. You play it because it's a fun platformer. You know, one of my favorite genres is the platformer, but I don't play a Mario game for the plot unless it's Paper Mario. It really is, you know, story-driven RPGs or action-adventure games that you have to weight the plot of more than, let's say, a shooter game or a platformer or what have you. What kind of stories do you like, Kevin?
I want more, true endings, more good endings that end in failure.
Okay, I like this idea. Expand upon it. How come?
Too often that it's the outcome in RPGs. What's the ending state? That's why the golden route is so popular among JRPGs, where everyone or almost everyone gets a happy ending, or at least a good, okay ending.
Before you move on, what is the golden ending? Define that term for us.
So you see this a lot with Japanese RPGs, where if there's, say, conflict or divergent or different endings, oftentimes you have, quote, the true ending. That is the developer's intended ending. And
the canonical ending.
Yeah. Sometimes, could be canon, could not. You have the golden ending, where it's the best case of all possible worlds. Take, for example, Three Houses. A lot of the critical acclaim for that game, the latest Fire Emblem, is there's no golden ending. We have four endings, and people have to die. There has to be suffering.
Yeah.
Not everyone gets to live. And that's why it's so successful. I want endings in JRPGs where the hero tries their best. They work, and they fail. They don't rescue the princess. They don't save their hometown. I want endings where it's on the decision to fight. You do your best. You fight. Doesn't matter if you win or not. That's almost irrelevant. But to fight.
I like your idea a lot. And it brings to mind the game Tales of Arise. And I'm not going to get too deep into it because this game only came out like last year. Not even last year. Very recent. It's the latest Tales game. And its world building is really interesting. It has interesting ideas. You think it's going to go one way, it kind of goes another way. The problem is that the game's narrative is building itself up for a tragic ending. And it almost gets there. Then in the last 5 minutes, the game pulls some Deus Ex Machina shit out of its ass and gives everybody a happy ending. And to me, the problem is not that it was a happy ending, but that it felt forced. It was not earned. Everything in the plot pointed towards the fact there was a huge possibility of a tragic ending. And then things happen. You're like, oh, there's the tragic ending. And then it doesn't happen. One of the most important things in a plot for me is the linear relationship between cause and effect. Tales of Arise almost broke that. Didn't quite, but almost broke that. And the reason why it's so important is that narrative coherence is key. We have to know why something happens. If I did X, I expect outcome Y. And if I get outcome Z instead, there has to be a good reason for it that I can understand. The worst offender of this is the Kingdom Hearts series. I will have a rant someday on the bullshit that Dream Drop Distance has in its ending, in which it just does not make logical sense whatsoever. And you need a plot to make narrative sense.
And that's why these power-ups from nowhere, or they win with the power of friendship that you see so often in certain types of games and anime. Looking at you, Fairy Tail, so unsatisfying because the seeds have not been planted, the ground has not been laid, it's new powers as the plot demands, and that eliminates any tension because no matter how dark it seems, you'll get some hitherto unforeseen power or weapon or item, and nothing matters.
We were going to talk at the end about why we chose Trails for this podcast, but I want to bring up a key point here. I fell in love with the Trails series by playing the first game and realizing that it respected the player enough to take its time in telling its plot, precisely for the reasons that we have just been talking about. The world feels cohesive. There's good cause and effect there. There isn't so much BS, power of friendship. It's a well-told story executed perfectly well. We will track how successful the Trail series continues to be with that, but I can tell you that with the first game and with the second game, you will be very, very happy with how it tells that story.
So one question I have for you, Colin,
Sure.
being more versed in JRPGs, is they're often said, maybe with some good-hearted mockingness or maybe more derogatory, they start small and end big in a bad way. First quest, save the cat. Last quest, kill God.
So basically every Persona game.
Is there a lot of truth to this?
I think there is a degree to truth in this. I mean, I just referenced Persona. That's the plot of a lot of the Persona games, definitely Persona 5. Kind of the plot of Xenogears as well. I mean, you literally kill Yahweh in Xenogears. You kill legit God. Yeah, it was very controversial among the evangelicals when it came out. You can imagine why. So definitely there is this tendency amongst JRPGs to handle incredibly big topics, world-ending type stuff. I showed you this book before. It's called A Guide to Japanese Role-Playing Games, published by Bitmap Books, 2021. It's this huge tome that details like a bunch of different RPGs, but it also has some interesting like thematic chapters in the beginning. Things like what is a JRPG, the influence of anime, remakes, stuff like that. And one of its thematic chapters is literally attack and dethrone God. That was there from the beginning of the genre. So it's definitely a part of it, but it's not the only thing. I mean, Yakuza Like a Dragon, you do not kill God. Whenever we're talking about Yakuza in this podcast, I'm almost always going to be using Like a Dragon because that's the only one that's an actual RPG. So yeah, it's a constituent element. It's a common trope, but it's not the only trope.
No, but also we see this a lot, so much in broader media. Take a look at the Star Wars movies. Everything has to be a galactic threat.
Yeah.
But just the stakes have to be meaningful and real. That doesn't mean it has to be the most expansive, most, save the city world. But take a look, for example, at the second Dragon Age game, where the stakes are real and personal, but it's so much less. It's not, solve the blight or kill the dragon. It's about the city, and it still feels real. It's impactful choices and consequences because you're made to care about the people, about the city, about Hawk, and so forth.
Well, I think that you're approaching a distinction that we haven't really even talked about amongst ourselves, but we have to. The difference between a narrative-driven or plot-driven narrative and a character-driven narrative. In your opinion, what's the difference between that?
Why does the story progress? Is it because characters are making understandable, maybe not rational, maybe not agreeable choices? Like you said, we can see the cause and effect. Or is it more the narrative conventions, generic conventions kind of mandate you have to have this kind of story, or the mentor has to die, or the evil empire has to rise. What say you? And it's almost like fate or some higher power is nudging things.
I don't have a good definition myself. What I was thinking was that, similar to your first definition about the character driven narrative, a character driven narrative is one in which you have a strongly developed character that makes choices that are understandable because you know that character, like it makes sense to that character. And then how the world reacts to it also makes sense. The Song of Ice and Fire novels, Game of Thrones and all of that, were very good at this. This is what introduced to me the concept of a character driven plot. That's not to say that plot driven narratives can't have strong characters, but it is often the world happening to the characters and not the other way around. Fire Emblem games, not as much Three Houses because you do have choice there, but like the first one on the GBA and a lot of them, this is basically you have a couple of characters, the Lord characters, that are driven by what's happening to the world, and they have an inner sense of duty to stop it. And then the joy of the plot of those games is seeing how the story unfolds. But it's not because you know Ellie Wood particularly well or Hector particularly well. You have an attachment to them because they're good units and because they're important, not because you understand the contours of their character.
And that raises some interesting stuff, Colin, about the nature of protagonists. Take a look at some of the most famous, well-known Fire Emblem protagonists. You have Chrome, you have Marth. A lot of them are reactive. They respond to stuff. And you see that in the latest one with Dimitri. He's reactive. He responds more than he acts, and his ideology is reactionary in the political sense. Take a look at the other two lords, at Claude and Edelgard. They have plot, they have scheme, they have plans and ambitions. They cause and they act, and Edelgard provides the spoilers war for the second half of the plot. And that's often with Fire Emblem, with the JRPGs, that's the villains to be active, to cause change. Mm-hmm. It's this stasis is good. People or faction to break the stasis are bad.
Yeah, I do think that we should move on to game systems because we are running out of time. We've talked a lot about narrative. Clearly, there's a lot of thought that we've put into how to evaluate a narrative. And that's going to be really important for us in this podcast because these are narrative-driven games. They're character-driven games too, but the story is a huge deal. But that's not the only thing that we are going to be interacting with when we play through the Trail series. We're also going to be interacting with the myriad of systems that are present in the game. In the first game, you have your combat system, you have your bracer point system, you have your quartz system, your inventory system, your equipment system. Games are constructed by different systems that all interact with each other to create the playable experience that we have. So we have to determine what makes good systems. What are your thoughts on that, Kevin?
So it cannot be repetitive, whether it's combat or progression or travel or just, it has to be some sort of variation where it's not just, oh God, here it is again. Something has to be different, or you have to mark it up with bells and whistles where I don't mind with the soundtrack or with the graph or just something. You can't separate them. If I'm going to be playing systems for 30, 40, 50, 60 plus hours, don't be repetitive or use the presentation as a sleight of hand.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Like, take a dungeon system, for instance, right? You could describe that as a system in which the ways that the dungeons are organized and you go through them directly impact how we experience the game, because in a lot of ways that's going to be the meat of the game, right? That is where you're controlling the character and you're exploring this dangerous area and you're finding loot and all of that. The narrative happens to you in JRPGs, as we discussed earlier. So I get your need for variation, but I think that only works for that kind of system. It doesn't work for equipment systems or skill systems. I don't need variation. I need consistency. I need something that I can grasp and understand. To me, the most important part of a given system in an RPG is that I can easily tell how to use it and why I want to use it. As so often, the best way to illustrate an example is to illustrate a counter example. So if you play Ys Memories of Celceta, another Falcom game, it has a weapon upgrade system in which you collect parts throughout the world, and then you can imbue your weapon or your armor with boosts to different stats or resistance to status afflictions or the ability to cause those status afflictions and all of that. On the face of it, it makes sense. And I think in harder difficulties, it does. But it costs money to do this. And when you get to the next town, you're going to be buying better equipment anyway. No matter how you upgrade your sword, you're still going to want to buy that new sword. And the game's not long, it's like 12 hours. So I quickly realized, oh, this is a system that I don't actually need to engage with in order to beat the game. It's probably different on harder difficulties, but on a normal playthrough, I could ignore that system. And if I can ignore a system in the normal difficulty in the way that the developers say, this is how we want you to experience the game, then it's not a good system because it did not prove to me that it needed to be there.
It has to be integrated into the gameplay.
Yes.
So, okay, do you think it has to be integrated into the story?
I think it helps the sense of immersion if it is, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. Think of a talent tree or like the sphere grid on in Final Fantasy X. These are leveling up systems in which it's successful because it gives the player choice in how your character is constructed. Especially talent trees in games like MMOs or in other RPGs. This is not tied to the narrative whatsoever. This is just how your character grows. And therefore, I don't think that you need to tie it, but it helps. The quartz system. I mean, quartz is a huge thing in the Trails universe. So it's tied into the narrative, but in that draws the player in. I was going to ask you a question. In your RPGs, what have been some of your favorite systems? What have been some of the most successful systems that you've seen?
Dialogue trees. And let me give an example and an explanation. It's conversational choices that matter. It's not the but thou must, or take, for example, some of the Elder Scrolls 4, where you have yes, angry yes, sarcastic yes, and no but yes choices. But I think I want to talk about Knights of the Old Republic 2, one of the, I think, most well-written RPGs of all time, but especially that final Act 1 confrontation with Atris in the prison under Telos. You don't fight. You don't, not a big boss fight like most games would have. But here in KOTOR 2, the game trusts the viewer, the player, to have this combat with words, with explaining why you defected, why you chose to follow Revan, the reasons you gave, the different choices you have, with the dialogue trees and the different outcomes that don't give you experience or different gems, different lightsabers, whatever, but gives you different interpretations and insight onto how the Jedi Order fell, how the exile came to be, how she or he is. And this kind of system that treats dialogue and communication as something essential and important and not just the filler between killing goblins or space aliens, it makes it so much better.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that. That's a really interesting example of ludonarrative interaction. By ludonarrative, we mean how the game and the narrative interacts with each other.
And if your TV tropes, it's gameplay, story, integration might be more familiar.
All right. So you had brought up the importance of the soundtrack and the graphics when we were talking about systems. And I interjected to say that I think that's more about presentation rather than game systems. So I want to get your sense on how important these things are first, because I think you might place more of an emphasis on it than I do.
I mean, you say the more presentation. I mean, you're wrong, but it's okay to be so.
Well, tell me why I'm wrong.
It's all part of the creating the gaming experience with the systems, with how these systems are presented, with the soundtrack, with the graphics. I'm going to be honest, Colin. I don't want to play an early 90s game. The graphics, the expectations. I mean, you can do great stuff, great games, stand the test of time. Baldur's Gate 2, for example, the isometric look, iconic, one of the best RPGs ever made. But graphics, it's it adds a style to it, and it draws the viewer in more, the player in more.
I mean, I agree with that. I'm not saying that presentation isn't important. I mean, on our outline, I list Persona 5. as a fantastic example of this. The systems in that game stand up by itself. The narrative stands up by itself, but you can't get away from how stylish that game is, how confident it is in its own art style that you're sucked in. The same can apply to Trails, especially I would say the first 5 games. I love the art style in the Trails games, and I love the soundtrack. But at the same time, if you remove the soundtrack, which they did in the Evolution ones and gave it a different soundtrack, or if you change the graphics, the core of Trails would still be there. The core of Trails is the game systems and the narrative. It's not how the game looks or how the game sounds. But one of the best things about Trails is how fantastic its art style is, and especially how fantastic the Falcon Sound Team JDK tracks are.
Okay, can you talk more about what's so good about Trails?
Yeah.
Who are the expert here?
I mean, I have played all the games. So one of the kind of, I don't want to say hooks, but one of the points of this podcast is that I've played a fuck ton of JRPGs. I've played all of the Trails games that are available in English, whereas Kevin, I kind of converted him to the genre by encouraging him to play Fire Emblem Three Houses, and he's dabbled in stuff here and there, but you don't have much experience in the genre or in the series. I think you've played Cold Steel 1 and a little bit of Cold Steel 2. So to me, I got into Trails because I had read a Reddit post about how intricate and detailed the world building was. COVID had just hit. At the same time, I was doing a 52 games beaten in that year challenge for myself, where basically it would have to average out that I would be beating a game every week. And I did fulfill that. COVID helped, for sure. But, you know, you're stuck in with months with nothing to do, play some video games. And so I decided to play Trails of the Sky, FC. Let's see how it goes. And what I got was this shared universe filled with interesting characters, detailed political systems. I mean, I'm a sucker for a good political plot, so the early games were like fantastic to me for that reason. But the way that the world was thought out, it all made cohesive sense. It dragged me in. And you get to know these characters, you know. After 9 games, you really get to know them. I played all the way through Cold Steel 3. Cold Steel 4 hadn't been out yet. And then I had to wait a couple of months for Cold Steel 4 to come out. And then I played Cold Steel 4. And Kevin, it felt like I was coming home. Like it felt like I was seeing old friends that I had gotten to know over the past year and then I hadn't seen for a while. But then there's Reen, there's Estelle, there's Lloyd. I'm like, I know these people and they know me. That's why I want to replay Trails again, because I know everything that happened and I want to see how thought out they were beforehand. Because not everything was well thought out. Not everything was planned from the beginning, but a surprisingly amount of it was. What got you into this idea of playing through the Trails games?
Well, I like, big, epic, long, interconnected stories, long-running TV shows, books, movies, even podcasts. But for video games, we don't see that much.
No.
Take the Elder Scrolls or take Fallout. The same universe, but we don't have much intergame connection for characters or themes or even places. A lot of times. You can do a lot of good stuff with that, but I was really intrigued and interested in this prospect of more contained universe and characters within the individual trilogies and arcs, and then within the wider 9 games and counting framework.
Yeah, I mean, it truly is unique. There's nothing else like it.
I can't think of anything else like it in Western gaming that has this combination.
The closest is Mass Effect, but that's the absolute closest.
Yes, 3, 4 games, but even then, you play Tally and 2 for the DLC, and that's it. You don't see Ashley or Caden more than that one scene.
I mean, they come back in 3. It's definitely in a shared universe, and you have shared characters. And there's really great DLC in the third one about bringing everybody back, except the person you killed in the beginning of the first game. Not the beginning of the first game, but the end of the first game. But that it's a trilogy. Yes, there's Andromeda, but Andromeda is a new thing, and they haven't made a new Mass Effect since. And BioWare's kind of shit the bed now. I'm not really going to trust anything they put out until the reviewers get to it first. Whereas with Trails, I mean, look, the games change as you go through. Cold Steel is very different from Trails in the Sky and Trails from Zero to Azure. In my opinion, the earlier games are better. The Crossbelt to me is the absolute pinnacle of the series, but I enjoy all of them. And there is a continuous through line of quality and focus. that you don't get anywhere else.
And I'm really looking to delving into this series with fresh eyes, bounce off with an experienced eyes, and just the game, but also just in the genre, the wider genre itself. And next week will be for the first part of the prologue.
Yep, we're gonna end this. I'm gonna slap together the episode, and then I'm launching Trails in the Sky on Steam, and I think you will be too. I think you might have a cookout to go to. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for listening to our first episode. This second episode should already be out by the time you're listening to this, because we're creating a bit of a buffer for ourselves. I hope that you enjoy what we're doing. Hopefully, as we get more listeners, we can start engaging with the community a bit. And if you guys would like to play along with us, please feel free. We're thinking of this almost in terms of a book club, a video game book club, but only dedicated towards Trails. So we will see you next week for our thoughts and impressions on the prologue. Bye-bye, guys.